I was talking to a colleague recently who had just returned from a diplomatic mission in a developing nation. He was showing me photos on his phone of their new high-speed rail and these massive, gleaming administrative buildings. He was genuinely impressed, talking about how these emerging markets were finally standing on their own 2 feet, free from the old colonial shadows of the past. He pointed to a photo of a ribbon-cutting ceremony, local leaders smiling, national flags waving, and said, "This is what true independence looks like in the 21st century. No more occupiers, just progress." But then, almost as an afterthought, he pulled out a copy of the actual financing agreements they'd signed to pay for it all. As he flipped through the dense, legalistic pages, his tone shifted. He pointed to a specific clause buried deep in the text, a structural adjustment requirement. If the country missed even a single payment, they were contractually obligated to privatize their water, slash their social spending, and essentially hand the keys to their national treasury over to a group of creditors in a city thousands of miles away. It was a chilling realization. The flags were flying and the anthems were playing, but the country was being hollowed out from the inside, not by an invading army, but by the stroke of a fountain pen. It made me realize that the old empires didn't actually disappear after 1945. They just traded their boots for bank accounts. We've been told we are living in an era of unprecedented peace, but what if the most successful conquest in human history didn't involve a single shot? What if the world wasn't liberated, but simply refinanced? Today, the chains aren't made of iron anymore. They are printed in ink and backed by the silent power of the dollar. That story, which is, it's just far too common, really sets an urgent stage for what we're diving into today. We are tracking a tectonic shift, this massive methodical transformation of the global financial order. And we're specifically focusing on how emerging economies are systematically, piece by piece, building alternatives to the Western-centric system that has dominated global finance since the end of World War II.
That's absolutely the mission. For you, the listener, we are really analyzing the twin pressures that are driving this change. On one side, you have this profound institutional rigidity, the structural resistance of the established system to reflect where economic power actually lies today. And then on the other side, you've got these proactive, very deliberate steps being taken through new alliances, BRICS, the AIIB, and new monetary tools, specifically local currency settlements.
Right, because the story of global finance has always been about power, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And if the world was indeed refinanced, as that story suggests, the core question now is whether these burgeoning efforts, these new financing tools and currency swaps, are they just augmenting the existing order, or do they constitute a definitive structural challenge to the U.S. dollar's dominance and the entire financial architecture it underpins? We have a lot of ground to cover.
We do. And to fully grasp the scale of this challenge, we really have to start by dissecting the historical architecture that is being contested, the very foundation of what you called the Quiet Empire.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack the history of how this architecture was first laid down, starting back in, 1944?
1944, the Bretton Woods Conference. You have 44 nations coming together.
And on the surface, the goal was, it sounds noble, stabilizing the volatile international financial system, preventing future depressions, supporting global trade and growth.
And it did achieve those goals, in a way, but with a fundamental structural bias baked in from the very beginning. While the rhetoric was all about multilateralism, the outcome was actually the centralization of power.
Oh.
It resulted in the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, the institutions that became known as the Bretton Woods institutions, or BWIs. These were presented as global bodies, but they were established as guardians of a new, completely dollar-centric global order.
So that centralization was achieved by essentially crowning the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. It was pegged to gold at first, and the IMF and World Bank were its institutional guardians, but the U.S. held the master key.
Exactly. Every nation's financial health, their ability to trade, their ability to grow, it all became dependent on a currency they had absolutely no right to print, and whose fate was determined by politicians and central bankers thousands of miles away. And, as long as the dollar was tied to gold, there was at least a theoretical limit on expansion. But that changed fundamentally in 1971.
That moment, when President Nixon unilaterally severed the dollar's link to gold. It's so often overlooked, isn't it? It feels like a technical footnote in history, but it was arguably the most profound shift in global power in the last century. We moved from a system backed by tangible wealth by metal to one backed by symbolic wealth.
It was a quiet coup. That's a great way to put it. It was achieved not by military might, but by a simple financial decree. And from that moment on, money was no longer backed by metal. It was backed by belief. Belief in the U.S. government's ability to pay, and critically, it was enforced by the mechanism of debt.
A currency without a fixed anchor. That's a currency without immediate accountability, isn't it?
Or it is. It meant the U.S. could effectively run deficits, it could export its inflation, and it could fund its global operations simply by having the world demand its currency. The chains were no longer made of steel. They were forged from interest rates.
And if 1971 was that quiet coup, then 1973 was the successful siege that followed. It was cemented with the creation of the petrodollar empire. This was the reconfiguration where the U.S. brokered these agreements, most notably with Saudi Arabia, ensuring that oil, the essential fuel of the entire global economy, had to be priced and traded exclusively in U.S. dollars.
And that, right there, instantly created a powerful and often inescapable feedback loop. Every single nation, from the smallest to the largest industrialized economy, suddenly needed dollars just to secure energy, to keep the lights on.
So this mandatory global demand for the dollar meant nations had two choices: either aggressively trade their goods and services to earn dollars,
or, and this was more often the case, they had to turn to international capital markets and the BWIs for dollar-denominated loans. This system ensured the world remained tied into a perpetual cycle of needing dollars, needing loans, and needing the BWIs. It shifted colonization from, geographic control to financial necessity. And it's this very system that emerging markets are now so actively trying to unwind.
This dependency created a crucial policy lever for the West, didn't it? It's called conditionality. And this is the real heart of that quiet conquest you mentioned in the opening.
Conditionality is the core mechanism of control. It's as simple as that. When a developing nation, maybe it's struggling with a debt crisis or currency collapse, when it sought stabilization funds from the IMF or development aid from the World Bank, the loans were provided, but only in return for compliance with highly specific policy changes.
And critics would argue these conditions weren't just about sound economics. They were often closely connected to geopolitical and policy goals of promoting a very specific Western-style liberal capitalism and reducing state control over the economy.
Precisely.
But hold on. Don't supporters argue these structural adjustments are necessary? That they're for fiscal responsibility and long-term stability? That they force countries to adopt sound economic governance?
That is the official justification, yes. That's the argument you'll hear. They argue that without these reforms, the money would be wasted, and the country would simply come back for another bailout later.
Right.
However, it's the details of these structural adjustment programs that drew such intense criticism and political backlash all across the global South. These programs typically obligated nations to undertake sweeping and often incredibly painful policies.
Like what, specifically?
The massive privatization of key national industries, whether it was electricity, telecommunications, or, critically, water utilities.
Water.
Yes. Along with slashing essential social spending and opening their domestic markets suddenly and often painfully to foreign corporate competition.
So the government receiving the loan was essentially forced to dismantle its own state structures and sell off its national assets, often at bargain prices. This directly ties back to that chilling realization my colleague had when he was looking at the fine print of that contract.
Exactly. From the perspective of emerging markets, these are not genuine reforms. They are shackles. They infringe deeply on national sovereignty. The leaders are presented with a truly difficult choice: accept immediate economic relief, which stops the bleeding for now, but in exchange for that, they get long-term policy dependency. They have to hand significant control over strategic national resources to foreign creditors.
And this policy of conditionality became the flashpoint, didn't it? It led to widespread debates, political instability, and in some countries, desperate protests and even riots, because the austerity measures directly impacted the lives of the poorest people.
It did. The power structure was entirely shifted. It allowed a lender thousands of miles away to dictate national policy on things like healthcare, education, and public utilities.
So the clash, then, is purely philosophical. The West insists on policy dictating aid that's tied to their standards of governance.
While countries like China champion a doctrine of non-intervention, they promise funding without forcing these huge political overhauls.
And this difference in lending philosophy is the fundamental fault line we're seeing today.
It is. Debt became the new colonialism, and the fight for financial sovereignty is the struggle to escape that conditionality trap.
Okay, so we have this entrenched architecture built on debt and conditionality. But the global economy, it didn't stand still after 1944. Emerging markets grew, and they grew exponentially. The issue is that the Bretton Woods institutions, they failed, spectacularly even. They failed to adapt to that new reality, and that created the real push factor for change.
And the central evidence of this failure is the IMF's own governance structure, specifically its quota system.
Explain that for us. How does the quota system work?
A member's voting power, their access to funds, their voice in the fund, it's all proportional to their financial contribution, which is called their quota share. And that share is determined primarily by GDP, trade openness, and international reserves.
So the logical expectation is that if a country dramatically increases its GDP, its economic output, that financial power should be recognized. It should be translated into proportional political influence within the fund. It should be a dynamic system.
It should be, absolutely. But it's not. Just look at China, for instance. For 2 decades, China maintained an average annual economic growth rate of around 9%.
Incredible.
It became the world's second largest economy, a primary engine of global growth. So based on the IMF's own economic formula, its quota share should have increased proportionally, and it should have increased frequently.
But the reality was that the institutional rules, the procedures governing any change were just too rigid. It created this massive status deficit. I mean, China's GDP share reached over 10% of the world economy at its peak, yet its quota at the IMF remained shockingly small. What was it? Around 3.7% at the point of the largest discrepancy.
That disconnect just perfectly illustrates the profound rigidity of the institution. Quota restructuring is rare, it's contentious, and it's subject to intense political negotiation because it requires established powers to voluntarily give up their influence.
And they are naturally loath to do it.
Very loath to do it. Even after a major reform package in 2016, which nearly doubled China's quota, it only reached 6.41%, which was still less than half of its 2019 GDP share of 12.66%.
Wow.
And IMF staff reports have openly acknowledged this. They've admitted that emerging markets and developing countries have been systematically and structurally underrepresented in the quota scheme for decades.
And this is where the political geometry of the situation just locks everything down, preventing any meaningful adaptation. It comes down to a single critical number, doesn't it? 85.
That's right, 85%. Any change to the IMF's Articles of Agreement, particularly quota reforms, must be approved by an 85% supermajority of the total voting power. Since the U.S. has always maintained a voting power above 16%, it was 16.52% as of October 2019. It acts as the sole veto player.
And this isn't just a simple veto. It's a structural guarantee that no organizational reform can proceed unless it aligns perfectly with U.S. policy interests, or, at the absolute very least, doesn't diminish its overall influence.
Correct.
So the design of the institution itself guarantees its failure to adapt to new global economic realities. It creates a system where rising powers are asked to fund and adhere to rules set by a declining share of global economic activity. It's a completely unsustainable power dynamic.
And if the IMF's internal rigidity wasn't enough of a problem, it's compounded by the volatility of U.S. domestic politics, which can effectively stall globally agreed-upon reforms for years.
The 14th General Review of Quotas, which was agreed upon way back in 2010, serves as the perfect, almost textbook case of this kind of obstruction.
It's the prime example. The G20 nations, representing the vast majority of the global economy, they reached a consensus in 2010 to transfer over 6% of the quota share to emerging economies. It was seen as a major, crucial step toward modernizing the fund.
Yet, implementation was stalled for more than 5 years. It only entered into force in 2015.
A 5-year delay.
And that delay was entirely due to the machinations of the U.S. Congress, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Under the U.S. Constitution, Congress holds the power of budget appropriation and jurisdiction over any IMF quota changes. This means the U.S. executive branch simply cannot consent to any quota increase or reform without explicit congressional authorization. Congress holds a crucial de facto veto over the entire global financial reform process.
So what exactly was the domestic political resistance about? Why did Congress, specifically, it was often the Republican-led House bloc, something that was globally agreed upon by everyone else?
It was a fascinating ideological fight, really. Congressional resistance was driven by 2 main concerns. Geopolitically, they feared that these reforms would significantly reduce U.S. influence over the IMF and grant more power to rising rivals, primarily to China.
Okay, that makes sense.
And domestically, the fight centered on how the IMF should lend money. They preferred the existing lending mechanism, which was called the New Arrangement to Borrow, or AIIB.
What's the difference between NAB and the standard quota resources?
It all comes down to control and conditionality. NAB funds are essentially supplementary borrowing lines that are provided by member countries. And critically, they come with far stricter conditionalities and tighter oversight, which gives the U.S. and other large donors more explicit policy influence over the recipient nation.
So it reinforces the old model.
Exactly. Quota resources, by contrast, are more standardized, they're more automatic. They provide the fund with greater flexibility and reduce the direct policy leverage of individual countries. So by blocking the quota reform, which would increase the role of quota resources, Congress was essentially arguing for maintaining stricter policy leverage and less multilateral flexibility. They were trying to further embed the very conditionality system we discussed earlier.
So the U.S. domestic political calculus, based on maintaining ideological control and policy influence, led to the deliberate 5-year delay of a critical global financial reform.
It did. And the result was this continuous cycle of disappointment across the emerging world. The Chinese government, which had really championed the reform as a sign of the West's goodwill, publicly expressed deep disappointment multiple times in 2009, 2014, and 2019 when these quota reforms stalled or were postponed again and again. They stated that this failure fundamentally questioned the legitimacy of the IMF and its ability to reflect the relative economic positions of its members.
This rigidity created a ripe environment for alternatives, didn't it?
It was the perfect permissive environment for something new to grow.
So the lesson learned by these emerging powers was clear. Begging the existing system for adaptation just wasn't working. The strategic pivot was to the institutional bypass, building their own institutions designed to circumvent the rigidities of the BWIs and offer financing on their own terms.
And the primary force driving this counter-institutionalization is the BRICS bloc, now expanded to BRICS plus MET. I mean, we are talking about a massive geopolitical and economic group here. It represents 45% of the world's population, 35% of its GDP measured in purchasing power parity, and 30% of global oil production.
This isn't just an informal club. Their explicit goal is to challenge Western-dominated global governance and ultimately to displace the U.S. dollar.
That's right. And their primary answer to the IMF and World Bank's architecture is their own financial scaffolding.
And that scaffolding includes 2 foundational pillars, right?
It does. The New Development Bank, or NDB, established in 2014 with $50 billion in initial capitalization, and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, or CRA, which is a $100 billion mechanism intended to provide stability and immediate liquidity during financial crises.
And the core appeal of the NDB lies specifically in its contrast with the World Bank's model. It offers non-conditional financing.
Exactly. The NDB is focused squarely on development financing, primarily for infrastructure and sustainable development, and crucially, it offers this funding without the political policy conditions associated with Western lending. This is the structural correction they are offering. It directly appeals to developing countries seeking greater autonomy, and it reinforces South-South cooperation. It's essentially filling the gap left by traditional institutions that often prioritize policy reform over rapid, non-conditional infrastructure deployment.
And we can see this shift most clearly by hearing the perspective of those on the ground. It makes me think of an engineer, let's call him Eris, who had spent decades working on infrastructure projects across Southeast Asia. He noted that in the old days, the Bretton Woods era, every loan for a road, a dam, or a port came with a debilitating thick book of conditionalities.
And that thick book, that represents the external control that we were just talking about. This engineer was operating under a master-servant dynamic where the host country's engineers and planners had to constantly defer to financial models and policy dictates set by lenders far removed from the local context.
But now he's working on regional projects, funded by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which operates very similarly to the NDB in its lending philosophy. And he felt the atmosphere had shifted entirely. He described it as a genuine partnership. There were no demands to cut Social Security, to privatize utilities, or to adhere to specific policy frameworks just to secure the financing for a necessary railway line. For the people actually involved in national development, this is a profound transition from debt as control to a world where emerging economies finally feel they have a seat at a table they helped build, free from those intrusive policy dictates.
And the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was launched by China in 2015, is perhaps the most significant institutional development since the World Bank itself. It began operations with 57 founding members, and it rapidly grew to almost 100 members. And notably, it succeeded in attracting several key U.S. allies in Europe and Asia, despite overt U.S. diplomatic opposition to its establishment.
The need was certainly there. Asia required an estimated $8 trillion for infrastructure from 2010 to 2020. That's an average demand of about $750 billion a year.
And the funding gap was just enormous. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, the AIIB, combined, couldn't come close to covering this demand. The World Bank's resources for the entire Asia-Pacific region, for example, were limited to only $252 billion over that whole decade.
So the creation of the AIIB was almost inevitable. It was a result of this massive disequilibrium between overwhelming infrastructure demand and the inadequate supply of resources from traditional Western-dominated multilateral channels.
It was. And this leads us to the crucial debate. Is the AIIB a complementary institution merely filling a funding gap? Or is it a revisionist challenge aimed at undermining the established liberal economic order?
There are good arguments on both sides, aren't there?
There are. Analysts have robust arguments for both views. The complementary view highlights that the AIIB's official purpose is explicitly to work in close collaboration with other multilateral and bilateral development institutions. And proponents will point out that the bank adopted BWI-aligned core values, insisting on being lean, clean, and green, and focusing purely on economic functions and infrastructure. So in this view, it's a modern, non-political MDB focused on practical needs.
But the revisionist view sees something more subtle at play. They argue that this bank promotes a Beijing consensus, a model based on active government intervention and a doctrine of non-intervention in the domestic affairs of the states it lends to.
And critics argue that by promising less red tape and fewer policy conditions on things like human rights or environmental governance, the AIIB appeals to states that are sensitive about liberal democratic norms. And in doing so, it effectively undermines the legitimacy of the BWI's insistence on good governance. They see this lack of conditionality as a deliberate strategy to offer a viable, attractive alternative to the Western model.
So whether the intent is purely complementary or strategically revisionist, the outcome is the same.
It is. The AIIB's existence provides a crucial, attractive, and non-conditional outside option for frustrated nations.
So these institutional alternatives like the AIIB and NDB, they address the debt trap. But the most direct challenge to the existing order is now coming from the monetary side. We're talking about the active pursuit of de-dollarization and regional solutions designed to mitigate those external financial shocks. And this is where ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is showing incredible foresight and speed with its push for regional payment connectivity and local currency settlement, or LCS, frameworks.
Their goal is twofold: lower transaction costs and reduce exposure to those external dollar shocks. And they are achieving this remarkably rapidly through the Regional Payment Connectivity, or RPC, initiative. It expanded from just 5 central banks in 2022 to 9 ASEAN members by 2025. This is a deliberate, state-led attempt to build parallel payment rails.
And the mechanism they're using is fascinating. They're leveraging existing national systems to create seamless, low-cost cross-border payments, often just by using QR codes.
That's the key innovation. They are linking systems like Thailand's Prompt Pay with Indonesia's QRAS. So a Thai tourist can scan a QR code at a vendor in Bali and pay directly from their Thai bank account in baht,
while the Indonesian vendor receives rupiah instantaneously.
Exactly. This move is incredibly effective for tourists and, more importantly, for small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. It enhances financial inclusion and efficiency across the board.
Let's connect this technical framework to the person whose life it actually changes. Think about a small-scale textile importer in Jakarta. We'll call him Budi. Historically, Budi had to convert his rupiah to dollars, pay dollar transaction fees, and then send dollars to buy thread from a supplier in Malaysia. His entire cost structure was in constant jeopardy.
Because that U.S. monetary policy volatility meant the dollar cost of his materials could spike at any moment. He was in a state of financial peril he had absolutely no control over.
Exactly. And that dollar-induced anxiety is a constant drag on businesses all across the global south. Every merchant engaged in international trade has to factor in the potential instability of a currency they have zero control over.
But thanks to the Indonesia-Malaysia LCS framework, Budi started trading directly in rupiah and ringgit with his regional partners. He avoided the dollar entirely.
And this illustrates how financial sovereignty isn't just an abstract term for central bank governors. It's about reclaiming the right for local economies to value their own labor in their own currency, insulated from external financial warfare.
And this strategy is proving to be effective. The statistics show that by 2024, 25% of Thailand's exports were settled in the local Thai baht.
25%. And that's a significant jump from just 14% back in 2010.
It is. ASEAN's proactive push for LCS is a clear sign of the decentralization of global financial power. It's strengthening regional currencies and making them more resilient against U.S. interest rate shocks.
And parallel to these regional efforts like ASEAN, we're seeing major players creating bilateral frameworks. China, for instance, has established the most advanced and extensive network of bilateral currency swap agreements.
A currency swap agreement is essentially a contract between two central banks. They agree to exchange currencies at an agreed-upon rate and amount, and then they reverse the transaction later. China has signed these agreements with 41 countries, totaling $480 billion. This has led the Chinese RMB to settle about half of China's cross-border trade.
And this vast network serves as a strategic move to internationalize the RMB, expand China's influence, and provide partners with a real alternative to U.S.-led financial systems.
So these bilateral currency swaps and this kind of South-South cooperation, they serve as a powerful bypass mechanism. It's a strategic tool to avoid traditional debt-based conditionalities and to foster independent growth trajectories.
And this desire for independence, it's deeply rooted in historical memory, isn't it?
It is. Many Asian nations, for instance, they vividly recall the profound shame and the economic devastation that was associated with the 1997 Asian financial crisis. They felt forced onto their knees to accept IMF bailouts that were widely perceived as less like aid and more like financial takeovers, complete with policy dictates that gutted their national industries.
So using bilateral currency swaps today is, for modern finance ministry, it's like a declaration of independence.
It is. It's a mechanism that allows nations to secure immediate liquidity and stability without accepting foreign control over their national budget or their policy direction.
And geopolitics is accelerating this trend, often forcing countries into these new frameworks. The most dramatic example being Russia's response to Western sanctions.
When sanctions restricted Russia's access to the dollar and global transaction networks like SWIFT, it had to pivot instantly. It had no choice. Russia was forced to settle up to 2/3 of its trade with China in RMB and rubles.
And this illustrates a critical point. Economic statecraft by the U.S. inadvertently encourages and accelerates these de-dollarization efforts by forcing non-aligned or adversarial states to innovate and find parallel systems.
It does. And India is expanding its own efforts as well, promoting the rupee through the SAARC currency swap facility and, perhaps more significantly, allowing banks from 22 countries to open special Vostra rupee accounts, or SVRCs, for trade transactions.
And the goal of these SVRCs is to facilitate international trade with India in rupees, avoiding the dollar entirely.
It's a diversification strategy. It's seen as a way to immunize the nation from the external pressure of sanctions directed at third countries and to enhance India's role as a regional economic center. It's a pragmatic defense mechanism against a dollar-based system that can be and has been weaponized.
But despite the rapid progress and the clear strategic need for de-dollarization, we need to acknowledge the nuance here. This is a very slow path. And these alternative payment systems have really only made a small dent in the pervasive use of the USD globally. The biggest challenge isn't willingness, it's structural vulnerability, specifically liquidity.
That's the critical structural obstacle. The US dollar maintains its hegemony not just because of US military power, but because of the sheer depth and liquidity of US capital markets. It's a safe, easily convertible, and universally accepted store of value. These new currencies, well, they often struggle with liquidity.
Can you give us a concrete example of how that liquidity problem plays out in a real-world trade agreement?
Sure. Look at the Russian-Indian trade attempts following the Western sanctions. The two nations tried to use local currencies for trade settlement. However, the effort ran into a wall because of the massive accumulation of illiquid currency surpluses, specifically Indian rupees on the Russian side.
So Russia was selling oil and commodities to India, receiving rupees in return, but then found itself with these massive reserves of a currency that couldn't be easily used to purchase goods from other trading partners or reinvested easily in global markets.
Exactly. The mechanism works for the single transaction, but then the exporting country is stuck with a pile of a currency it can't use globally. It becomes illiquid currency wealth.
And that structural obstacle forces their hand, even among strategic partners.
It does. The result was that Russia increasingly requested settlement in the more globally convertible Chinese RMB. And this dynamic, it risks creating a new asymmetry. While the original goal was to escape dollar dependence and achieve bilateral sovereignty, the lack of depth and convertibility in smaller currencies risks reinforcing the attractiveness of the RMB.
So it could strengthen China's relative position while simply substituting dollar dependence for a different form of centralized dependency, limiting the autonomy of the smaller partners. A new form of financial asymmetry.
Precisely.
Okay, so the overall picture shows a global financial system under intense, methodical pressure. It's built on the institutional frustration of the global South and backed by this burgeoning new institutional and monetary power. So as we synthesize all of this, what is the end game for the global financial system?
Well, the first step in evaluating the future is recognizing that the BRICS plus expansion is not a monolith. The countries pursuing membership are driven by a diverse set of often overlapping yet distinct motivations. They are not simply joining to oppose the West, but for pragmatic self-interest and diversification.
We can probably categorize these interests into three main motivational areas. First, the economic motivations.
These are centered on practical needs. They are seeking expanded trade, alternative sources of financing like the NDB, and deeper economic integration outside the Western sphere. Ethiopia, for example, is primarily motivated by the need to secure new avenues for developmental and financial assistance, which is critical to their rapid, sustainable growth plans, and which the traditional BWIs just cannot fully satisfy.
Then second, there are the political and status motivations, the desire for a louder, more recognized voice on the global stage, one that's commensurate with their economic reality.
Yes. India views BRICS as a crucial instrument for fostering multipolarity and for claiming leadership of the global South. South Africa, similarly, uses the platform to push for long overdue reforms in powerful legacy institutions like the UN Security Council and the IMF, advocating for fairer representation for African nations. It's about prestige and institutional leverage.
And finally, there's the powerful safety harbor motivation, exemplified by countries seeking mitigation from U.S. diplomatic coercion, including sanctions.
Countries under intense pressure, like Venezuela, view BRICS as crucial for securing funding and facilitating transactions in currencies other than the US dollar, effectively counterbalancing US influence. But it's not just adversarial states. Even countries like the UAE, who maintain strong economic ties with the US, value BRICS as a vehicle for strategic autonomy and for ensuring they are not completely at the mercy of US geopolitical whims or future sanctions.
So it sounds like most members are hedging, which is smart. They're avoiding the block trap.
Yeah.
They want to maintain good relations with everyone.
Precisely. The UAE and Egypt, for instance, they emphasize that joining BRICS is a pragmatic approach to multilateralism and economic diversification, not an explicitly anti-Western stance. They seek financial options, not political allegiance. This nuance suggests that while they want to reform the system, they aren't necessarily trying to burn it down.
And this diversity leads to the fundamental tension, doesn't it? Does BRICS and its associated institutions constitute a challenge to international financial governance based on the counter-institutionalization strategy?
That phrase, counter-institutionalization, suggests the goal is not total destruction of the old system, but strategic displacement.
That's the key distinction.
Right. The BRICS strategy is to set up new institutions closer to their own interests and reflecting the economic realities of the 21st century, not necessarily to dismantle the established governance system, but to change it by generating necessary adaptations. They are a revisionist group, challenging the legitimacy of the status quo, but perhaps not a full reformist group aiming for immediate, sweeping overhaul. Their pressure forces the legacy institutions to either adapt or become irrelevant.
Looking ahead, analysts seem to be proposing three possible scenarios for where this institutional competition ultimately leads. The first one is the optimistic view.
The optimistic scenario sees the BRICS NDB successfully consolidate its role as the definitive, leading, Southern-led multilateral development bank. This acceleration of institutional pluralism would inject genuine competition into global finance and ultimately strengthen multipolarity. In this view, the BWIs are forced to become more equitable and responsive to avoid losing relevance entirely, leading to a healthier, more balanced global financial ecosystem.
Then there's the pessimistic scenario, which paints a much less impactful future, leaving the status quo largely intact.
In the pessimistic scenario, the NDB simply fails to scale up substantially. This stagnation could be due to internal governance frictions between members, limitations on capital mobilization, or geopolitical tensions that paralyze decision-making. If this happens, the NDB and AIIB remain symbolic, constrained additions to the existing landscape. They serve as a safety valve, perhaps, but they lack the scale to fundamentally challenge the dominance of the dollar or the BWIs.
And finally, the most likely path, the hybrid future, which incorporates elements of both competition and convergence.
The hybrid scenario suggests that the NDB and AIIB will partially converge with existing MDB practices. They will have to balance their powerful sovereignty-based discourse, that promise of non-conditionality, with the pragmatic need to adapt to rigorous global financial standards to secure broad international capital and maintain credibility. This will result in a complex, hybrid order of cooperation, institutional pluralism, and ongoing contestation. The ultimate choices made by these new institutions, especially regarding transparency and environmental standards, will determine whether they become a genuine cornerstone of a new multipolar order or remain a complementary yet fundamentally constrained addition to the established system.
So this deep dive has shown us that the global financial order is grappling with a profound strategic shift that originated in frustration. And that frustration was rooted in the institutional rigidity of the Bretton Woods institutions and the effective veto power granted by U.S. domestic politics.
And that frustration was met with a sophisticated, strategic, two-pronged response. First, the institutional emergence of non-conditional alternatives like the AIIB and the NDB. And second, the monetary shift toward de-dollarization through mechanisms like ASEAN's local currency settlements and these vast bilateral currency swaps.
The silent power of the dollar is facing a strategic long-term challenge built on regional solidarity and institutional competition. This transformation is not a sudden, loud revolution. It is a strategic, methodical, long-term refinancing of global sovereignty, driven by the desire for autonomy and representation commensurate with economic reality. It's the sound of the chains printed in ink slowly starting to fray.